This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. I'm joined by Grady Miller, an American history teacher at Davidson Middle School in Hillsborough County. We're going to talk about different systems of government, a few of which are sometimes talked about in American history. Grady, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Fine. I appreciate it.
Glad to have you. Where would you like to start?
I have a couple questions for you, if I could. First of all, could you please briefly describe for me the terms parliamentary, federal, confederal, and unitary?
Absolutely. What you're talking about are different forms of government. And what I appreciate is that we're starting off this conversation by talking about governments, but even by saying they need to be described, we are making it clear to people that people form governments. People decide, somebody decides how someone's going to be governed. It's not like it's some decision made out in the universe somewhere and it's an automatic. And so it's important to talk about the idea that there are different forms of governing and different ways that people either govern themselves or are governed by others. So I'm going to start with confederal. A confederal system is one where the focus of government and the seat of power is held at the smaller government unit level. Now, in the United States, we would say that would be a state-centered government. But we also have smaller government units in other places around the world that are called departments, that are called provinces, that are called other things. But at the same time, it's still the idea that if you're looking at the focus of government being at that level, at the lower government level, then it's confederal. Even the United Nations is considered a confederal government because if the focus of government is at that lower level, then there is no central authority, and there's no central authority at the United Nations. Now, when we're talking about a unitary government, and I kind of laugh when I say that unitary is my favorite form of government because my name is Terry, as you know, and uni means one, like unique or unicycle, right? So one Terry. So I sometimes say to my students, well, I'm in charge because this is a unitary government. There's one of me and I'm in charge. And really that's what it means for a unitary government is that all the power of government is centralized in one place. And that would be the power of legislative, the lawmaking power, judiciary, and the executive power. When we're talking about a parliamentary system, we're talking about the idea that you have separation of powers in terms of powers, but you don't have a separation of selection processes. So for example, sort of the best known parliamentary government is in England. And in England, the parliamentary system is that people are elected to the national legislature, and they're all called ministers. And the majority party among those ministers selects the primary minister to be the chief executive. So what we get from primary minister is prime minister. And so even though we might have a chief executive in the United States, that person is elected separately. But in England, that person is elected by the legislature, by the majority party. So the parliamentary system means that you focus your attention on the legislative branch, and then they select who's going to serve them as the primary or prime minister. Now, the last one that you asked me about was a federal government. And in a federal system, you have shared powers, which means that you have a central government authority, and you also have a set of state government authorities, and they also share powers. So what that means is that, for example, in the United States, which is a federal system since 1789, the United States not only has a federal system in that there is a national government and we have a supremacy clause in the United States Constitution, Article 6, and basically what that says, if there's a national law and there's a state law that contradicts it, the national law reigns supreme. At the same time, there are certain areas where the states can decide to do what they want. A state can decide, for example, whether or not it's going to have speed limits and what those speed limits should be. And then finally, there are shared powers, and those shared powers that we're most familiar with are taxes, that both the national government and the state governments can tax.
Okay, thank you. Those were some great definitions. Now, of the ones that you described, which is the most popular?
The most popular? Well, it depends on whom you ask, of course. But what we find is that when we're talking about the role of citizens and the role of citizens having a say, we find that the federal system and the parliamentary system seem to sort of work the best for the people. In a federal system, the idea is that as long as you have an opportunity for the people to communicate with their government, and there are more opportunities at that lower level because government is just down the street from you, literally, then that's going to be more popular. However, what we find is in parliamentary systems around the world, those are also multiple party systems. And having a multiple party system, some people argue, promotes higher voter turnout because people believe that they have a voice. They have more of a choice among several political parties.
Okay, thank you. Can you also provide some examples of some countries that are in the news today and some of the forms of government that they use?
You know, that's a great question, especially, you know, one of the dominant concerns of the early 21st century has been the war in Iraq, okay? And the war in Iraq, you know, interestingly enough, we have to remember that when Saddam Hussein was governing Iraq, first of all, he was elected to his position. In his last election, before he was taken down by the United States, he was not only elected, he was elected with 100% of the vote and 99% turnout. Now, who wouldn't love that? Is that a mandate or what? But what we really know is that that type of approach clearly shows that there wasn't a real competition. And yet, because Iraqis had lived under that government, most of them for their entire lives, that type of government, sort of an elected dictator, if you want to call it that, they didn't really know what it was like to have any other kind of government. So one of the struggles that we see around the world in these countries that are trying to shift from unitary type governments to either federal or parliamentary type systems, the struggle is that there hasn't been that political learning during the life cycle that would cause somebody to say, you know what, I want something different, and I want this other alternative that I've never experienced. So what we found in emerging democracies is a lot of struggling. And that struggle is that the people sort of know what they don't want, but not necessarily what they do. Now, you asked the question in terms of what's the most popular. Well, we know that the Latin term, the Latin root for popular is also for populace or the people, right? So what would be most popular with the people, and what criteria would we use to measure that? Well, I'd have to say, even though I was born and raised in the United States of America, I'd have to say that the most popular are those parliamentary systems that are predominant in Western Europe, because they are well-established parliamentary systems and they have multiple party systems. And the rules are written in such a way that in some countries, as long as you get 5% of the vote, and please understand, you're not voting for candidates, you're actually voting for the party, and the party decides who's going to actually represent the party should the party get enough votes. So in some of these countries, like Italy, for example, if you get 5% of the vote in that country, you are guaranteed representation in the legislature. So if I represent a marginalized point of view, I know I don't have to get a majority of people to agree with me to know that I'm getting a voice in government. Now, Grady, among my very small number of talents, I can read your mind. And I know that your next question is, but wait a second, why would it be important for somebody to be a part of a 5% of the vote? Because guess what? When you have all these different political parties getting these relatively small percentages, in order to get something done, you have to build coalitions. And when you have to build coalitions, you have to include more voices. And so what do we see? That the people get it, that we have much higher voter turnout in those countries with parliamentary system. They're more popular with the people because there are more people involved. And part of that is that even the smaller voices, not the smallest, not the 1%, but even the 5, 6, and 7% have to become part of these coalitions, and therefore their voices get heard.
Okay, that's a great answer. Thank you. Now, out of these different forms of government that you've described, are there any similarities that all four share?
Well, they're of course made up of people, and that's one thing that they all share. And the other thing is that they have all sort of have the point of view, and I sort of really want to make this clear, and I appreciate the question, that no government is formed of the belief that it is not in the best interest of the people to govern in that way. Now, of course, an outsider can have a different opinion. Obviously, we know that the United States president at the time, President George W. Bush, and of course a majority in Congress who supported him, were of the belief that Saddam Hussein was not governing in a way that was in the best interest of the people of Iraq. But certainly, those people who had power in Iraq believed that what was in their best interest was also in the best interest of the people. So by governing for their own benefit and their own sake, they were also governing for the better sake of the people. For example, when we look at some countries where we might disagree with the form of government, it might be a communist form of government, it might be a dictatorial form of government, what we also find is that a lot of those countries don't have some of the problems the United States has, such as homelessness, right? If you have the government involved in every aspect of your life, and there's no private sector, you also ensure that people have jobs and people have homes. People have their basic needs met. Now, it could be that it's only the basic needs and there's not a lot of diversity after that, but certainly what I think is really critical to point out is that every government that is formed is of the belief that it is in the best interest of the people and of the country to govern in that way, even if there are pockets of people in that country and there are people outside that country who have very diametrically opposed views on that question.
Okay, and that answer totally makes sense. Now, for American history students and civic students in the classroom, why is it important for them to learn about other forms of government?
I think absolutely it's important to learn about other forms of government. After all, even in the state of Florida, it's very important to note that even at the state level, where we have this federal system, the states are given so much flexibility that a lot of decisions that are made by the Florida legislature can impact national politics. And I'm going to, if you don't mind, Grady, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. For example, in the state of Florida, the Electoral College, the Florida legislature decides that we're a winner-take-all system and not a proportional system. The Florida legislature decides when our primaries are going to be. The Florida legislature has decided that we're not going to have a runoff primary since 2002. The Florida legislature also decides that we're going to have a closed primary. Can you imagine how different election outcomes would be at the national level because of those decisions made by state legislatures? So it's very important for students to know that the way that we get governed and the way that we are governed is a series of decisions. And if they can impact those decisions because what they believe might be in the best interest of the country or of the state, then certainly that plays a big role in how governance might happen. So if you think about it, right, how might things have been different if our primary system was an open primary system, and that means that independents can vote in primaries? How might things have been different in the election of 2000 if we had a proportional allocation of electoral votes instead of Florida being sort of in the middle of this firestorm because Florida had 25 electoral votes and it was an all or nothing proposition, and Vice President Gore did not have the 270 that he needed, and nor did Governor George W. Bush.
Right.
But if that had been, since that vote was 50-50, minus 537 votes, right, then certainly the allocation of those 25 might have been 13 versus 12. And guess who would have become president? It would not have been Governor George W. Bush.
Right.
Because Al Gore had 266 electoral votes before Florida, and if you added 50% of Florida's 25, he would have been over that 270. So I think it's important, the idea that if citizens understand that they can have an impact even in how they themselves are governed, then they're going to also have, a sense of believing that the government is part of their lives and they're part of the government's lives. Grady, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed talking to you about these topics. We've been talking about different systems of government and how they compare to each other. That's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine.